Thank you. Our next paper will be by Michael Jones, entitled The Egyptian Antiquities Conservation Project, 10 Years of ARCE's Cultural Heritage Conservation, 2004 to 2014.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. This is going to be quite a challenge, 10 years in 20 minutes. But I hope to be able to give a fairly rapid overview of what the Egyptian Antiquities Conservation Project has achieved, looking at projects which I've been responsible for ARCE over those years. This project has been funded throughout by funding from USAID and is the third of three very generous grants from USAID in support of cultural heritage preservation in Egypt managed by ARCE. Some of the projects which we'll be looking at, like the Red Monastery project, which is represented in this first slide here, of the church itself in its modern setting, started under previous grants, this one in particular under the Egyptian, the EAP, the Egyptian Antiquities Project, and this grant, the EAC, has enabled us to continue and complete projects started earlier and also to undertake new projects. And I must also mention, of course, that we have worked totally in complete collaboration with the Egyptian Ministry of State for Antiquities, the former SCA, who issue our permits and allow us to do this work in Egypt. So we are extremely grateful for that. And also closely with the Coptic Orthodox Church, without whom we wouldn't have been able to carry out the projects in the churches and monasteries, which we'll be looking at as well. The list of projects that were on the original scope of work for the Egyptian Antiquities Conservation Project, the EAC, is in front of you here. The green ones represent the projects which were carried out and completed according to the scope of work at the beginning, without modification, really. The blue ones represent projects, the two blue ones, which had to be modified, and in the case of Marina El Alamein on the north coast, couldn't be completed for various reasons according to the original plan. And site management in historic Cairo is now being completed, a project being managed by Jerry Bacharach, which we'll talk about in a minute. The orange ones are projects which were conceived, but for various reasons couldn't be carried out. And the green ones, as I said, represent successful projects. But first of all, a little bit about what I think conservation is about, what it represents and what it's for, and some of the ideas which we've tried to apply to these projects. Conservation, although it tends to make one think it's focused on things, buildings, historic sites, historic monuments, is actually about people. Because all these things and buildings were constructed and made to support cultural contexts which are represented by these tangible things which are left over and which are constantly being reinvented and given new value and significance, particularly by a conservation project. But they start with the people whose intangible cultural values were supported by the things which we now have left behind. One way in which we can see ourselves as part of this continuum is in an example such as this, which is the Visitor's Book from St. Anthony's Monastery, and this represents the Byzantine expedition of 1930 led by Thomas Whittemore, in which participated Alexander Piankov, much better known for his later work as an Egyptologist. We're also very much reminded of the fact that the only constant in cultural heritage is change. And we shall come back to Luxor and the Mosque of Abu Haggag in a little while, but these four pictures illustrate some of the fortunes through which Luxor Temple and the mosque have been through since the 1860s, when the top left was taken. Below that, a picture of about 1900, with the equivalent of what Andrew has just been talking about at Gorna, carried out in Luxor Temple at the end of the 19th century. The top right, after the fire, when we were given special access at the invitation of the Luxor Inspectorate of the MSA to document and record this monument, and at the bottom what it looks like now, or rather last year when I took this photograph. And also how many of our pictures, our images now represent unrepeatable images. This picture, taken in 2000 from the roof of the New Winter Palace Hotel. By 2007, the view looked like this, and now, of course, the New Winter Palace Hotel no longer exists, so the rooftop view is unrepeatable. It's also all about communication. This is a photograph of the Italian conservators doing their cleaning tests at Esna at the monastery of St. Matthew the Potter, in which engagement with the local community was crucial. And engagement also with the people who use and live in these monasteries and churches here, the late Luigi de Cesaris and Father Thomas at St. Paul's Monastery. And also the engagement of scholars, because apart from the people who live in and use these structures, the representation of them to the secular world, or the lay world, or the interested public, comes through the work of scholars, the publication of the results for academic purposes, but also providing the raw material for anyone who is interested in the results of the projects, particularly the emerging history of the sites. And tourism, now in a very parlous state in Egypt, but until very recently one of the most important economic supports for the Egyptian economy. So coming back to our list, we'll have a brief look at the blue projects. This is the Roman mining settlement at Sikate, where in the end we couldn't actually do any physical work, but we had the opportunity to undertake a fairly thorough photographic coverage at the beginning of the project before we had to abandon the work. This is Marina El Alamein, which advanced much further with anastylosis carried out in the Roman Forum. Marina El Alamein was a major Roman trading centre on the Mediterranean coast. In historic Cairo, we are coming to the end of a project which, in its initial phases, was intended to develop a visitor plan for the area, linking together all the monuments which ARCE has worked on since the middle of the 1990s. In the end, one of our major partners, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, withdrew from the area and made it much more difficult for us to liaise with the local authorities. And a reduced scope of work is now working on information panels in Arabic and English, and we've also produced in both languages pamphlets to be distributed to visitors and a booklet, which you see here and here, which highlights the ARCE projects in historic Cairo for tour guides and for tourists. And now the green projects. Staying in Cairo, the mosque of Aslam Salah Dar, a 14th century mosque, at the heart of the thriving community of historic Cairo today. It's the white building towards the lower right-hand side of the photograph. The two minarets near the upper left-hand side are the minarets that stand on the top of Bab Zuwayla. This is a photograph before treatment, showing the state of the mosque. You can see the roof of the minaret in a damaged condition, the damage on the facade, but also illustrating how the mosque stands at the heart of a community, that the mosque is itself a community centre. First, documentation of existing conditions, crucial in all these projects, and I use this particular example, but this sort of work is carried out at all the sites we've worked on, mapping the structure outside and inside, graphically and photographically, and planning the stages of the project from this documentation. Employment for local craftsmen engaged in the repair work on internal fittings, and visitors from the Egyptian and expat communities seeing the work in progress, an extremely important part of the outreach of these projects. This project was directed by Dina Bachum, whom you see in the centre of the picture wearing the blue scarf, and this was carried out in collaboration with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, with whom Dina was working at the time. Dina is now working as a consultant with several ARCE projects, including the new initiative at the Islamic Art Museum. And the internal structure of the mosque, as the project was coming to an end, rehabilitated into use as a functioning mosque again. Another monument, or archaeological site, but also historic monument, equally important as part of a living community, is the Red Monastery, the so-called Red Monastery Church near Sohag. And this is the longest continuing project, beginning under EAP, Egyptian Antiquities Project, adopted as part of the EAC, Egyptian Antiquities Conservation Project, and now coming to an end as the grant finishes this year. You can see here on a Friday morning the local faithful of the Coptic community at the church for services. Again, documentation here, architectural documentation of the same kind as I showed you at Aslam Salahbar Mosque, but also including the recording of reused hieroglyphic blocks and other spolia from Roman buildings which were built into the church. The church dates probably to the turn of the 400s, 500s, the 5th to 6th centuries, and inside is painted from floor to ceiling with late antique paintings, and these of course have been the most visible result of the project and the major part of the project intended to clean and conserve these paintings. The project is directed by Elizabeth Bowman, and the cleaning and conservation of the paintings has been carried out by the Italian team of wall painting conservators who began working with us at St. Anthony's Monastery in the middle of the 1990s. Last year, with the completion of the work on the paintings, lighting was installed, and you can see the effect of that now in this picture and the next one. Much of the finishing off work, the architectural work, the finishing off of the interior, fittings, lighting and so on, is being directed by Nicholas Warner. And this is the ground floor level below those semi-domes and vaults, and we're now at the final stages of rehabilitating the interior with a new altar table, a new screen, which will allow the church to go back into use as a functioning church, as part of the community. And it's important also to mention that we're also involved now in a community relations project as part of what we're calling our exit strategy from this site, also led by Dina Bahum, whose family is from Sohag, to enable the clergy and the local people there, local community, to understand what this project has been about and how it fits in to their own relationship with their heritage. Another monastic project which we were able to accomplish was at St. Anthony's Monastery, where renovations being carried out by Father Maximus revealed earlier buildings under the floor of one of the monastery churches, and we were able to help him install a display and presentation with a glass floor so that the below floor discoveries can be displayed to visitors inside the church. And we're now working with him on the development of a museum in the monastery to display the monastery's artifacts there. And this will also include archive photography from the Byzantine expedition of Thomas Whittemore, which I showed you in the visitor's book at the beginning of the talk. At Abydos, the Shunit Zabib, we've been able to help by supporting the work of the New York University project there, directed by Matt Adams. And another major archaeological project that I think is one of the most important initiatives that ARCE has been able to accomplish with this USAID funding has been the training of Ministry of Antiquities inspectors in modern standard techniques of archaeological excavation. And this comes out of a collaboration with Ancient Egypt Research Associates, directed by Mark Lehner, Marcin Camel and Anna Tavares, which began at the Giza Pyramids, but was extended to a project at Mitrahina, Memphis, and also an emergency field school, a salvage archaeological field school in response to the work that was going on directed by the Governor of Luxor for the redevelopment of Luxor and the exposure of the Avenue of Sphinxes. Staying in Luxor and coming back to the Abu Haggag Mosque, which I mentioned earlier, in 2006 there was a serious fire inside the mosque. The local inspectorate there, at that time directed by Mansour Barayek, invited ARCE to do a documentation and recording of it, and this was led by Nari Hampikian, who had worked with ARCE on the Babzuela project under a previous USA grant, and with students from the architectural faculty at Cairo University and from Kenya University, recorded and documented the interior of the mosque as it fits into the upper levels of the Ramesses II First Court of Luxor Temple, and were able to produce the first ever proper architectural documentation of the mosque and its different phases of architectural development. And also, as part of the Avenue of Sphinxes project, we were invited to record two other buildings, one the Mupashkish Mosque, the yellow building on the right in this picture, and the 1920s Art Deco police station, which you see in the centre of the picture, Mupashkish Mosque, which also, besides architectural and physical recording, involved that intangible element which I mentioned before, interviewing the custodians of the shrine of Sheikh al-Mupashkish to understand and document ethnographically their relationship with the mosque and the saint. Luxor Police Station, whom probably very few people were sorry to see go as it was being demolished, was in fact an interesting Art Deco building. This is not an example of demolition as a conservation method, but as the Cafetto Cornice was coming down, we were actually, the documentation was actually going on the demolition site itself. And again, the architectural documentation. In Luxor Temple, the Roman frescoes dating to the reign of the Emperor Diocletian at the turn of the 3rd, 4th centuries. On the left is a before image with a test cleaning, and on the right the finished section of that part of the paintings. The publication of this project is now at Yale University Press, and the niche with the 4 co-emperors as they're preserved. And the publication will not only focus on the paintings, but contextualize that tetrarchic phase of Luxor Temple in the bigger picture of the monument. Finally, another documentation project, which has recently been published, directed by Melinda Hartwig, in the Tomb of Mena, was perhaps a groundbreaking project, as it not only included the actual conservation of the paintings themselves, but also conservation work on the paintings themselves, but also non-invasive analyses of pigments and materials, the documentation of them, the interior reorganization of the arrangements for visitors, again directed by Nicholas Warner, and exterior signage so that guides who are not allowed to talk inside the tomb would be able to explain to visitors before they went inside what the tomb is about. And this is Jocelyn Gohari explaining the tomb to the ARCE tour a couple of years ago. And finally, the publication of that project, and perhaps there's one picture encapsulating what is really the end result of all these projects, or should be, which is the publication and the dissemination of all this work to a much wider public than will ever be able to visit the sites themselves. Thank you very much. That wasn't bad.